Edie?
Madam Chair, we're now live.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Town of Ajax Heritage Advisory Committee meeting for Wednesday, June 3, 2020. This meeting is being held electronically and will live stream on the internet. Due to the COVID-19 emergency and requirements for physical distancing, no in-person attendance is permitted at this time. All regular practices and procedures of the committee continue to apply during the meeting. If we do encounter any technical difficulties, we may take a brief recess while they are resolved. Thank you for your patience. To start our meeting today, I'd like to ask if there are any conflicts of interest from the committee members for any items that we'll be discussing this evening.
No, Chair.
Nope.
Nope. Thank you. We have no conflicts of interest. I'd like to move on for the approval of the minutes for the previous meeting held on March 4, 2020. Are there any questions or comments on the minutes?
Yes, I have one.
You may go ahead, Beverly.
Yes, I was asking, I'm going to discuss with Sarah, or ask Sarah what the result of the poll was for the starting of the meeting earlier that was discussed at the end of the minutes. There was a poll that was going to be sent around about starting meetings earlier.
Thank you, Beverly. Through the chair, we did solicit feedback from committee members. It is something that I'd still like to bring back to the committee to further discuss, as it was pretty divided in terms of the feedback we received. And now that we're dealing with an alternative format of meeting, whether or not that is factoring into availability as well, if that might have changed. So it's certainly something that we can revisit and discuss at a future meeting.
Sounds good to me.
Is that good, Beverly?
I'm fine with that.
Okay. Are there any opposed to the minutes? Okay. May I have a motion to adopt the minutes then? Okay. Seconded?
Second.
Okay. The minutes has been adopted. That has been carried. Thank you. We will now move on to the presentation and discussion items. Mike, may I hand over to you to take us through points 4.1 to 4.7?
Absolutely. So good evening, everyone. There are several items that I'll be taking you through tonight. So I'll just continuously roll through each one, but I will pause for questions or comments at the end of each individual item. Okay, so to get started, item 4.1, and actually before I even jump into 4.1, I'll just preface everything by saying a lot has happened over the last 3 months. So many of these items, especially those towards the front part of this presentation, are more so updates than anything else on things that have been going on. Items that would typically have come to the committee, but did not because there were 2 months where we had to cancel the committee meetings. So we're starting with item 4.1, which is a heritage permit for 78 Church Street South, which is known as the St. Francis Center. So I think we're all familiar with the location of the St. Francis Center. It's on Church Street South, right near the intersection with Christina Crescent. And the building is a beautiful building designed by Henry Langley, one of the showpieces, I would say, of our heritage assets here in Ajax. So this property is designated under Part 4 of the Ontario Heritage Act and is owned by the town. So the town's undergoing a project now that's really going to focus on 2 different things. The first is a restoration of the stained glass, and the second is improvements and repairs to the roof. So starting with the stained glass, it's really just starting to show signs of wear after so many years. So there's a little bit of deterioration. So a conservator has come in to do an assessment and make recommendations on what should be done to the stained glass, and that's the project that's before us right now. So I've got a few different images on the screen just to give you a sense of some of the items that will be tackled through this project. starting with the exterior covers of the windows. So these are just starting to look their age. You can see a crack in the window covering on that first image. But even from the standpoint of their transparency, they really don't do any benefit to the building. They, like I said, look their age, and it's time to have them repaired. Beyond that, they're also not vented properly. So this can have thermal impacts for the windows. As hot air gets trapped in there, that can have impacts on the stained glass. There's also been some issues with the structural elements. So if you look at that center photo, you can see a bar right through the middle, which is called a saddle bar, and it's starting to rust and corrode. So these are still structurally, they're all right now, but in time they won't be. So we need to get ahead of that project. The lead cames, which are the sort of black pieces of metal that you see running through any stained glass, are starting to show some wear as well. So there needs to be putty applied just to stabilize the individual pieces of glass in their place. And the glass itself is experiencing breaks in many locations. There's issues with the paint in others. And there have also been past interventions that really haven't been appropriate. So that second image from the left shows what I can only assume to have been an attempt at fixing one of the situations by using plaster to repair the stained glass. So obviously not something that's appropriate. The second part of the project is the roof project. So in terms of a rationale or an explanation for this one, is very straightforward. The roof is leaking and that's damaging the interior, so it needs to be dealt with. The situation looks like back when the town took over the building and took on the initial restoration project. The asphalt shingles were put on, but they were put on a substrate, so sheathing and the underlying boards that weren't in the best of condition. So in addition to actually flying off in windstorms and that sort of thing, water is seeping in and sort of wreaking havoc on the building. So it's not only the shingles themselves that will have to be replaced, but also the roof deck. So jumping back to the window repairs, this project is being led by an expert in the field. So Eve Gwynnon is quite well known in the field, and she's worked on a number of buildings, a number of prominent buildings at that, everything from the Parliament buildings to Casa Loma to right now the Massey Hall renovation. So very, very experienced in her field. And what's going to be happening is where the windows are in good enough shape that they can be left in place, they will be left within the building and they will be cleaned and any minor repairs will be made. If the repairs are more substantial, they will actually be removed, brought to her studio and fixed there. So things like glass replacement, paint touch-ups, anything to do with the lead cames and the stabilization of the structural elements will be handled at her studio. And then, like I said, the other component of this is replacing the existing Georgian wire glass with new vented laminated covers, which should make the church overall more appealing from the outside and protect the life of those stained glass windows once they're repaired. Now, the roof repair has been an interesting discussion. So obviously the decking needs to be fixed as part of this project. The town will also be putting in new flashings. So that's the aluminum pieces where the roof connects into the building. So those will be replaced with new aluminum flashings to match what's there currently. But a product that we will be using is EnviroSlate. So this will sound familiar to everybody. We've discussed EnviroShake at length for previous properties. This is the same company, but instead of a replica cedar shake, it's a replica slate product. So there's an example here shown on the left. And one of the discussions I was involved with our operations team is, what colors do we use? What patterns do we use when we're going through this project? So what we tend to do is we tend to look back at historical evidence when we're moving forward with a project like this. And unfortunately, we have a lot of great images of the church from a historic perspective, but nothing in detail enough to really show what that slate looked like, either originally or later on through its life. So we've really had to work from what evidence does still remain. and really all we can look towards right now is the tower. So the tower still maintains its original slate. This is going to be kept through the project, but what it shows us is there have historically been at least two tones used on this. So you can see the primary rectangular slates, and then the ornamental detail, which is the fish scale slates, which are almost a sort of blue color, light gray to blue. So we're really looking to this existing slate to help us move forward and decide what is appropriate for the church itself. So here's another image just showing the rectangular slate. And I just wanted to share this because while you would say it's all the same slate, it's all from the same quarry, it's the same material, you can see quite a bit of variation between the individual units. So this is something that's important to us because any replica material isn't going to have this. It's going to be more of a standardized color. So that's something we need to keep in mind. So in making the decision on which products to use and how to use them, we had several different options. The first and most straightforward was simply to just go with one color and apply that directly to the roof. But if we wanted to get into multiple colors, that could be done one of several different ways. We could go with somewhat of a random pattern. We could start looking at sort of more purposeful designs, things like diamonds, angles, zigzags, even a basket weave pattern. But the key is really to keep in mind the historic precedent and what was on this church originally. And as I said, we don't necessarily know with any certainty. So what we finally decided on was to go with the two-colored pattern and do it so that 70% of the units are the darker charcoal gray and 30% are the stone gray units. So this somewhat reflects the patterns, or at least the colors we already see in the tower element. Initially, I was pushing for going with a single color, and my reasoning for that was we didn't have any historic precedent. We shouldn't be forced into making a decision of what pattern to use. But the team in operations raised a really good point, and they said this is quite a large roof. It is very visible as well, and when you're applying this product to an area that large, the flatness of a single color could really show through. And what we have currently is asphalt with 4 different colors mixed into it. So keeping a little bit of diversity will probably keep it more in tune with what people are used to. And the more I thought about that, I realized that those were 2 very, very good points. So the random design was really because we can't find any historic precedent. So we shouldn't be really going with something that was never intentionally on there. So the randomness of this will just sort of lighten up overall the impacts on the building, but at the same time give it that bit of variability so it does mimic a little bit more the natural variations that you'd find with a slate product. So the permit was actually issued on April 17th. The operations team was supposed to come and present to the committee back in April. And the discussions on things like patterns and colors are the kinds of discussions that we would have had it not been for the pandemic. But because this project was scheduled to start early in the summer, so this June, we really had to get some decisions made on that and push forward. Drove by the site yesterday. It doesn't look like the work has physically started, but there were trucks on site looking like they were staging the area. So I imagine it'll be starting very soon. So any questions through the chair, I guess, relating to this item? Nope. All right, so we'll move right along then. The next item is another heritage permit, this time 77 Randall Drive, which is St. George's Anglican Church. And again, this will be a property that's familiar to everybody on the committee, as we spoke to it just this past February. So the location is actually 77 Randall Drive, as I mentioned, which is at the intersection of Kingston Road and Randall. This is quite a large parcel, but the historic church that we're concerned with sits at the north end of the parcel, right beside the historic cemetery. So here's an image. We've seen this image many times, and what this shows is essentially the cedar roof that's on the church right now, and what a prominent part of the building it is. So we spoke last February at length about the comparisons between EnviroShakes and natural cedar. Had that fulsome discussion. It was the church's request to use EnviroShake. They specifically preferred that material because they said there is an ongoing history of animals providing a nuisance at this property, and they seem to have figured out how to have their way with natural cedar. So for them, it was more of a long-term investment, and they've been told that EnviroShake would offer a hardier solution when it comes to any of those animal impacts. So just to recap our motion from the February 5th meeting, it was that the applicant for Heritage Permit 1/20 be permitted to use EnviroShakes as a roofing material in place of the existing natural cedar shingles. So a couple updates on the project. Just very recently, within the last few weeks, I was contacted by representatives from the church, and they said that they have finalized their search for a contractor. And they've gone with T. Hamilton and Son Roofing from Scarborough, who have quite a bit of experience working with EnviroShakes. So the work was expected to start at the end of May and take about a month to complete. I did not notice anyone on site when I was there the other day, so they may be a little bit behind the schedule. But it is good to know that it is about a month's worth of work, so it should wrap up fairly quickly. I think the most significant impact I have to offer is that the church was unable to secure one of their funding sources that they had relied on, so that forced them to revisit their scope of work. And what they determined was that the bell coat would not be fitted with EnviroShakes. So the bell coat is that ornamental feature that you see off of the roof of the structure. And at first, when I was informed of this, I was a little bit concerned. My concern really stemmed from the issue that, as we mentioned with the last item, when you're using a new replica product, the end result can be quite flat because you don't have that variation in the natural product. And given that you will still have that variation for the bell coat, I was quite concerned that this contrast would make things even more noticeable in terms of the new product being used. However, after sort of playing around with some renderings and that sort of thing, and I should say these are just renderings done in PowerPoint. This is nothing done professionally, but it kind of helped ease my mind in terms of the impacts that it would or could have on the church. And I think because the product is a gray color, which is the overwhelming color of the natural cedar anyway, it's not as impactful as I was concerned that it might be. Another argument for keeping the historic material on the bell coat is it provides a reference point. So if these are in fairly good shape and they can hold up the life of the new EnviroShake roof, it's a good reference point for the next church committee that's doing a roof project, let's say 50 years down the road. Gives them a good opportunity and understanding about the history of this building and the fact that cedar shingles were the original material and that they should remain a viable option moving forward. Oh, so I'll skip back here. So before I move on to the next item, any questions or concerns about this one?
No.
No? Okay. And
I've
Camille
got
will be,
something.
oh, sorry.
Sorry, Mike.
Yep.
Isn't there another thing that has the same shakes near the entrance to the cemetery?
There is, yes.
Are they planning on doing anything about that or leaving that on its own, or?
They're planning on leaving that on its own, and that was always the intention, because that structurally, the roof isn't as important. It's not an enclosed space, So the condition of those were good enough that they were to remain cedar for the time being anyway. So no changes to that.
So it will match this bell coat thing that you,
Yes,
so it sort of ties into, okay.
it does. Yeah. So the bell coat won't stand alone as the only thing on the property now in Cedar Shakes. It will sort of have that visual connection to the gate at the front.
Okay.
Mike, one question, please. With the bell coat, how do they intend to ensure that it stands up with the new roof?
Sorry, so when you say stands up with the new roof,
Meaning so that it doesn't fade away. Like, are they planning to do some kind of remedial work on it, or like sealing or something that would cause it to stand up for the life of the new roofing?
sure. So what I've been told by the representatives from the church is that the condition of the shakes on the bell coat are far better than they are elsewhere on the roof. So the main reason for that is the slope of that feature. When
Okay.
water hits it, it doesn't sit there very long. So I think the idea is that that should be able to last for the life of the new roof. If it doesn't, then they'll have a decision, and that decision will be whether to fit it with new cedar shingles or whether to use the Enviro Shake on that. So one other item that was mentioned to me is if they do come across any last minute funding, their intention will be to use that funding to actually do the bell coat with the Enviro Shakes as well. So I don't know if we've heard the last word on this one, but I did think it was important to share with the committee in the case that they don't come up with those funds, and people weren't left wondering as to why this one element hadn't been repaired. Okay, so we'll move right along then. And I was going to say, I think this is the first time I've actually stayed on track for time, so I'd probably jinx myself by bringing it up. But the next item is a heritage permit for 10 Elizabeth Street. So this is one that just sort of came out of the blue the other day. 10 Elizabeth Street is one of about 6 houses that are south of Elizabeth Street Cemetery on the west side of Elizabeth Street, so backing onto the Duffins Creek Ravine. And this property, as you can see from this image, is unique in the sense that it's about twice as wide as most of those other properties. And this comes into play because very recently, the owner made an application to sever the lot and produce 2 lots. And as a result of that, was provided some direction with items that they needed to rectify on the existing property with the home. So the home itself is a very modest home. It's a sort of Gothic style cottage, very similar form to many of the buildings in Pickering Village and many of the buildings in the more rural parts or formerly rural parts of Ajax or the township of Pickering as well. So this is a very, very common building style. It's not all that impressive standing on its own, but it helps to contribute towards the character of the Pickering Village Heritage Conservation District. And this one has undergone a number of changes over time. So the material you see on it is a 10-inch aluminum siding. So obviously not an authentic material. The windows themselves have been changed over time, the door. There's very little remaining to this building that is authentic other than its general shape and massing. One of the interesting things I'll point out is the window in the upper dormer. And you can see that on first glance, it appears to be an arched window. But when you look a little closer, you can see the top of the rectangular window in behind. So my assumption on what happened here over time is historically this would have been an arched window, but because those windows, when they're replaced, need to be custom made in order to fit the opening, the owner, prior to the Heritage Conservation District, just likely installed a rectangular window either for ease or for financial reasons. So as I was out actually doing an inspection for another heritage permit that we'll get to, I believe is the next item, I was driving away from the site and came upon this. So there was obvious works going on at the property, and they had not been approved, or they had not sought approval of a heritage permit. So I stopped at the site, had a quick conversation with the crew doing construction there, asked to speak with the owner. The owner wasn't on site. So I was really left with no option other than speaking to bylaw services to try to put a halt on this work. So the reason for that was we had absolutely no idea what was happening here, and we needed to get a sense of what was going on before we could allow the work to continue. So that very same day, by the end of the day, staff from bylaw services were out on site and issued that notice to halt the work. Over the next day, I essentially dedicated all of Friday to information exchange with that owner to ensure we knew exactly what was happening at the site, and to provide any permissions that they would need to continue moving forward with the project. So just to give you a sense of some of the things that were happening, obviously the removal of the existing cladding, which really isn't an issue because it was not sympathetic to the heritage character of the building anyway. But some of the more concerning work that was being done, for example, was the closure of the windows on the south side. So you can see where that one window is boarded up. And then if you look at that, that addition in plywood, there's another window facing south there that was being boarded up. So this was work, at least the window on the addition, it was being boarded specifically because of requests of the planning department and the building department at Ajax. So when this lot was subdivided, because of building code regulations, you need to keep a certain distance between buildings to prevent fires and that sort of thing. And because of the location of this property so close to the lot line, the window on that addition wasn't permitted. So they were actually directed under the building code to cover that up, which isn't really an issue from a heritage perspective because this is a contemporary addition anyways. But still, you can see, obvious visual changes happening to this building, and being located within the Heritage Conservation District. These are the very type of projects that we need to be involved with, not only from a sort of legal standpoint in providing that authority, but also from the standpoint of being able to provide advice and guidance on materials to use and styles of features and that sort of thing. My mind was eased a little bit as I walked north and had a view southward of the building, because I could see that they were further along on the rear portion of the building, and the product that they were using for cladding looked to be actually a lot more sympathetic than what had been up there before. So as I mentioned, there was 10-inch aluminum cladding, which, I mean, aluminum obviously isn't a historic material, but when you're using a product that has 10-inch widths, that doesn't generally match the type of wood or the size of wood that would have been used in a house of this age. Excuse me. So it was very visible from the street that there was not an authentic product being used. It's a little tough to see here because of the dark color of the new cladding, but if you can see any of the details, you'll note that it's actually very similar in profile to the historic wood cladding that's already at the front part of the building. So the scope of the work, I've already covered some of this, but covering the two south-facing windows, the replacement of the siding, the front door, as you can see in this image, has also been replaced. It was previously galvanized steel, and it's galvanized steel again. Replacement of the aluminum soffit, fascia, and eaves, again with like material. And then several things that we typically wouldn't become involved with because they're considered general maintenance items that don't necessarily need a heritage permit. So things like putting on the new asphalt shingles, considering it was already asphalt shingles, and some of the new landscaping that was done. So for example, there's a new walkway leading from the curb up to the front door. So within that day, that Friday, I was able to get all the information that was required from the owner, and eventually issue the heritage permit. Now, this was, I'd say the owners were very, very thankful for this, because they had their crews booked for the weekend, and they were quite concerned that they'd continue to have to pay their crews and not get any of this work done, and potentially lose them for a number of weeks before they could finish the work. The reason that everything was able to move forward so quickly with this one was really the fact that all of the work being done either improved the current condition or maintained what was already there. So there are obviously some things that aren't ideal. Something like the front door, for example, which is galvanized steel, but it was galvanized steel before, so it's no worse than it had been in the past. And the only truly lost feature, if you can even call it that, was the arch in the top dormer. So, and as I mentioned previously, that arch was only there in terms of the siding anyways. The window had already been replaced prior to the Heritage Conservation District. Now, the really unfortunate part of all of this is this kind of work is exactly what we look for every year when we're giving out our grants through the Pickering Village Facade Improvement Program. So this is the exact kind of project that we could have been supporting had we known what was happening. And not only have we supported it, but we could have provided that extra financial incentive to have them do some of the works that would have related to a better end product. So I'll go back to the door. A lot of time, I mean, a galvanized steel door is a good quality door, and most of us with more modern houses probably have those types of doors. But in a house like this, where the entrance is so apparent from the street, it would have been a great thing if we could have gone back to a historic wood door, and providing some funds to do that could have been the incentive that the owner would have been looking for. So overall, I think it's just really a lost opportunity. And hopefully the owner kind of shares this experience with other owners in the area to say, the town, I think there is always a concern that sometimes the town will really slow things down when it comes to heritage permits. That's not necessarily the case. But when you move beyond the timing, I think the end product, as I mentioned before, could have been much better with a little guidance from myself, from the committee, had we been meeting, even on simple things like the shingle roof. They did the shingle roof first. They did it in a brown color, I imagine because that's what was already there. But now they're using an entirely different color of cladding that really doesn't match with that brown. So in the end product isn't what it could have been, and just sort of an unfortunate end on this one. So any questions or comments on this before we move forward?
Yes.
You've got everybody.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for the presentation, Mike. So did the owner was hesitant to come to the town because they were worried about delays, or they didn't know that they had to come to the town? What was the reason?
I don't know with certainty what the entire extent of the reason was. It was expressed to me that they didn't believe they had to get a heritage permit, and I do believe they were sincere in that comment, partially because they were working with the building department at one point, and the building department informed them that they didn't need a building permit to do this work, and that is correct. None of the work that they were doing requires a building permit. It does, however, require a heritage permit. So I think that was somewhat lost in translation somewhere, and they were not aware of the situation. And once we did halt the work, they seemed very apologetic about what had happened. And luckily, as I've mentioned several times, the work that was being done was pretty good work. So in the end, nothing too disruptive happened with this property.
Thank you.
Yeah, I've actually gone by that one a bunch of times, and it actually looks really good now that it's all finished up.
Yeah, so I've got a couple photos here that I can actually scroll through as well. Let's see, just make sure this is still working. Okay, so just to remind everybody, so that was the previous. This is the what it was, the shape it was in when I came by, and then this is what it looks like now. So this photo was taken yesterday. The white door really stands out, sort of in stark contrast to everything else. They've informed me that they are painting that red. So that has actually been included as part of the heritage permit to say that the door must be painted red. So that sort of, I think the red color goes quite well, a sort of deeper cherry red goes quite well with these darker tones, but it'll also lead your eye away from the door, which is probably a good thing.
Mike, I think Beverly had a question for you.
Yes, I did. I'm just wondering if this is a prime example of us not, I don't know whether we want to quote advertise, but is this something that we're not allowing, or we're not letting the people in the district know that these grants are available to them? Is it something that we should be putting in a, like say a flyer or something within their tax bills or things, or is the information just not getting out there to them?
So I think that that's a fair point, and it's a really good point, actually. We've sent out notices about the funding programs, not necessarily on an annual basis, but at least every 2 years. We've sent these out to ensure that people are aware of these programs. And at this point, so many of the properties within the village have received grants at some point that notice, for the most part, anybody who's been in the village for a year or two at least are aware of these programs. I think one of the issues here might have been that this property changed hands fairly recently, and that's how the project came forward with the severance, and then subsequently this renovation project, where it was a newer owner looking to make some improvements and then sell this property. And I think part of the reason they weren't aware of these programs was because they were fairly new to the area. But your point about doing a better job at getting the information out there is something I think we do need to do. We've continuously seen the numbers come down in terms of the number of grant applications we get each year. So it is something that we do need to advertise and just keep on people, because this is money specifically directed for this purpose. Mm-hmm. And it pains me each year we go by without using the entire fund, because not only are those projects left on the table that won't be done, but it also means that there's a chance that that same level of funding won't be available the next year, which is quite a scary thing, because we do have a real gem in Pickering Village, and it's something that we should be doing absolutely everything we can to protect.
Yes, I agree.
I think there's one more question from Pam.
No, it was answered. Thank you.
Okay, good. You can go ahead, Mike.
I have a question.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Stephen.
Oh, Michael, if someone goes in from the village to get a building permit, shouldn't the building department notify you or the Heritage Group?
Yes, so typically that does happen. And on our system, when anybody does come in, when you look at this property, it is flagged as being part of the village. And right on that front page, there are notes that say, speak to the heritage planner. Because there wasn't any sort of formal request to the town about getting building permits, I think it's something that just happened sort of casually, resulting from the conversations about the severance. Information was just passed along, like I said, casually, to say, no, you wouldn't require those type of permits for any of the work that you're proposing. And I don't know if the heritage permit was mentioned, because I do have colleagues that were involved with the severance, and they did say that they were quite confident they had mentioned heritage permit being required. So it's really tough to determine exactly what happened in this case, if the information wasn't conveyed clearly or if it was confused between the two types of permits. I'm not entirely sure, but yes, I mean, we do have that safeguard in place to ensure that if somebody comes in and makes a formal request about a building permit, it gets bounced to me automatically.
Okay, because I remember this property last year when it came up for the severance. So It's,
Yeah.
okay. Good.
All right. So no more questions on that one. We'll move right along to the next item. So 49 Old Kingston Road. This is another heritage permit and a very straightforward one at that. So 49 Kingston Road is the Casa Verde restaurant building, green building, which we'll see in a second. And it's wedged right between Kingston Road and Old Kingston. So I'm sure this is a property that many people are familiar with. You know, the fact that it's a green building is something that makes it stand out even more. One of very few in the town, I can only imagine. But a beautiful little building, again, same sort of style. It's that sort of Gothic cottage. And in this case, beautiful setting with mature trees growing around it and some really tasteful landscaping along the streetscape as well. So what was requested here was actually the removal of 2 trees. The first, which is shown in this image to the left, is a 39 centimeter diameter at breast height basswood or basswood, and then the other one was same species, and it was a 47 centimeter diameter at breast height tree. So both of these trees were showing obvious signs of decay, and because of their location, both next to a historic building, but perhaps more importantly, on a patio for a restaurant, there were clear safety implications for these trees. So the owner came forward a couple weeks ago asking for permission to remove them. Now, as is the case with any tree removal in the village, we require that that be supported by an assessment from a certified arborist. And in this case, we received the arborist report, and the arborist did confirm that these trees were in a state of decline and there was nothing that really could be done to help save them. There had been quite a few number of limbs removed in the past, you know, trying to extend the life of these trees and get rid of any of the problem areas, but even that wasn't enough. So they've come to the point where really the only option left is to actually physically remove them in their entirety. So to give you an idea about the context of these trees, they predate or I would imagine they predate at least the most recent version of the patio on this building. So the patio was actually built right around the trees. Now, this is important because it has implications for what we can request as part of the heritage permit approval, and I'll get to that in more detail in a moment. Also interesting to note that this is these 2 trees, which are the trunks that you see on, I guess, the left-hand side of the screen, are part of a little grove of quite mature trees, I guess 5 in total, where the ones towards the west are on the neighboring property and actually seem to be in much better condition. So as I mentioned, we had the support of the certified arborist report to say, essentially, there was nothing else that we could do here. So the heritage permit was issued on May 21st. Now, typically, when a mature tree is being removed from the district, we require that it be replaced. Excuse me, not necessarily in kind with a species of the same, or with a tree of the same species, but we actually have a guide or a couple pages in the Heritage Conservation District plan that talk about appropriate tree species to use. In this case, we recommended new plantings, but we did not require them. And the reason for that was there's simply nowhere on this property to put these trees. So initially I had thought, well, if trees are being removed, then you can just put them where they've been removed. But once I saw the context and the surrounding patio, I don't really think you'd have a good result with planting new trees there. Beyond that, you would have to remove the stumps entirely in order to get the soil volume in there for the new trees, which would mean tearing apart the entire deck, which I don't think was really the end goal for the owner. So, you know, I made sure to say we're recommending that new trees be put in their place, you know, if a proper space is found for that, but it isn't a requirement or a condition of the approval. I did drive by yesterday and took a quick look. I didn't stop, but as I was driving by, I had a look over and saw that there was a tree removal crew there, and saw that they hadn't yet done the work. And then on my way driving out the other direction, I looked a little more closely, and the trees had actually already been removed. So the fact that I couldn't tell that the first time around, I think is a good thing. The canopy of those trees from the west is so sort of substantial that it still covers a good deal of this property. So the impacts aren't as significant as I was afraid they'd be. And I think it would take a keen eye to really notice, or somebody that spends a lot of time dining out on the patio there, to notice the difference with those trees having been removed. Any questions on this one before we move forward? All right, we'll keep going.
Go ahead. Yes.
I guess my question is, do you run into tree problems a lot in this heritage portfolio? This is the first time I've run into a tree issue, and possibly could be the only time, but does it come up quite often?
I'd say it does. We explicitly state in the HCD plan and within our heritage permit materials that any removal of a tree requires a heritage permit. So this is something over the last, I've been working with the town about coming up on 5 years. I'd say we've probably had 4 or 5 of these applications over that time. So it's not incredibly common, but it's common enough. It is something that happens a fair bit. And I think it's because, you know, there are a lot of older trees in these neighborhoods, and generally speaking, people do their best to maintain them. But once they become a liability from an insurance perspective, they, you know, once they can provide rationale or justification for them having to be removed, there's very little we can do to prevent that. So I think our role really becomes focused on the replacement. And what we don't want to see in the long run is all of these beautiful old mature trees disappearing and nothing put back in their place.
Right.
It's usually, some of these trees do make a major difference. I'm just thinking about one in at 62 Old Kingston Road, which is a property where there was a major grant last year, and they had a tree in the backyard that was removed a little while back. And as I was going by a couple weeks ago, I knew something looked different, but I couldn't put my finger on it right away. And then, you know, it kicks in and you realize, oh yeah, there used to be a green canopy sort of floating over the roof of that building, and it's no longer there. So the idea is, when we have people replace these things, it will take, you know, dozens of years to sort of get back to where they were, but eventually we'll sort of keep up with that tree cover in the village, because it is something that really does add to the character of the area. All right, so if no other questions, we'll move right along. Elizabeth Street Cemetery monument stability. So another one we're familiar with that had an update within the last 3 months. So I think we all know where Elizabeth Street Cemetery is and are familiar with the context there. The update I have for the group is really that you know, we've been at a bit of a standstill with this one. This is one of the first projects that came across my desk when I started with the town. And 5 years, or close to 5 years later, there still hasn't been a lot of action. And that has largely been due to the fact that we've been trying to work in partnership with the owner of the property, but we haven't really gotten any traction in kind of forcing them to do what's needed to stabilize these monuments. And the reality is, we can't afford to continue to sit back and not do anything. This is a designated heritage property. It's one that a lot of people have a keen interest in. A lot of people are familiar with from going on walks. And it really does not represent the town very well when somebody goes through a designated property and sees monuments that have physically fallen over and haven't been repaired. So we had to start thinking about what are our options in order to see some movement here. So the step that I was able to take was to bring this issue to the senior management team and look to them for some recommendations on what our next moves should be. So I know we're all familiar with the conditions of the cemetery, but I just wanted to bring up a few photos in case we do have anyone on the line tonight that doesn't know the full history of this site. And you know, there are some things like broken tablets or monuments. We've got other situations where monuments have actually been moved from their home and just leaned up against a tree because, you know, they've come loose from the ground. We've got a number that are in the sort of early stages of leaning. We've got others that are in a little more advanced state of leaning. And then ultimately, when you have a leaning monument, the end result is always going to be the same, and that's going to be a fallen or toppled monument. We also have several scenarios where monuments are very, very close to the ravine edge. Now, thankfully, with some of the work that TRCA has been doing over the past few years or few months at least, they've come back to tell us that, you know, no slope is entirely stable, but in terms of its stability and the vegetative cover and the sort of things we have happening in this case, there is a fairly good stability, so we don't have to be overly concerned about these monuments starting to roll over the edge of the slope anytime in the immediate future. So when speaking with the senior management team, I wanted to bring forward a few different options, and I'll just sort of skip through these quickly. First is the do nothing option, which you're told always has to be an option, but I don't think it was one that any of us really would have favored. The only advantages you could really take from something like that is the fact that it's quick and easy for the town. It means we don't have to spend any more time or effort or money on this. But what it would end up with is just a continuation of the situation that we have now, which we know we cannot allow to happen any further. The next option was for bylaw services to actually issue an order to the property owner to say that they need to bring that property into compliance with the property standards bylaw. Now, the advantage with that is it's a little more heavy-handed of a tactic. You know, we've been sending letters and we've been told, yes, this is on our radar. It's something we're going to eventually do, but there hasn't been any movement. So it's come time that we need to start investigating the options where we come forward with a little more force. And that's what notice under the property standards bylaw would do. The disadvantage there is really that it could set off a long process where we start getting into the sort of legal implications of what may happen with this property in the future. Another option would be the transfer of land. So this would be something where we just went forward to the property owner and said, we as the town have the resources available to be the owner and to do the work that needs to happen. The advantage here is obviously that we would gain full control over the continued conservation of this site. The disadvantage is, you know, all of the legal implications of taking on ownership of this property in the long term. And then the last option I presented was just a straight town repair, where the town would go in on this instance and do the work ourselves. Now, I positioned this as being something that would probably cost, you know, between $10,000 and $20,000. I don't have exact numbers, but the work that needs to be done is fairly limited. I think the priority work is really providing a new base for some of the monuments, and that can be done fairly inexpensively. So again, the advantage is that we'd be in full control of this situation, but the really big disadvantage here is it sets an extremely dangerous precedent to other property owners to say, we can let our properties fall into decay. Don't worry, the town will bail us out. That is in no ways the message that we want to send. So when I positioned this to the senior management team, I really pushed forward for option number 2, issuing an order, thinking that is the most reasonable first step. And the team seemed to agree. So what we decided on is that we will put together a strategy. So planning, working with bylaw to move forward on a property standards order. Now, with that said, there are certain considerations that need to be made. We're in a very strange time right now with the pandemic, and I don't think it would be entirely fair for us to move forward as we typically do, where we issue a notice and say, you know, you have 30 days to comply. At this point, I'm not entirely sure if the team, the crew that I've been in communication with that does this sort of work, if they're even available right now. So we need to keep that in mind and sort of scope this work in a way that is respectful of some of the restrictions that are likely part of our sort of new reality. The other thing that was discussed with the team is our ability to provide funding support for this. So we do have the Pickering Village Facade Improvement Program. A project of this nature would meet the requirements for funding. And I think, given the scenario we've had in the last few years where we've had at the end of the year, money just taken out of this account because it went unused, it's in everyone's best interest to take some of that funding if possible and apply it to a project like this and finally, come to a place where we've dealt with this issue for once and for all. Oh. So any comments or questions on this one?
Yeah.
You may go ahead, sir. You may go ahead.
Yeah, Mike, when we first talked about this a few months ago and TRCA first reported on it, they said there was excess garden waste and excess foliage and undergrowth at the top of the slope. Has anything ever been done about that?
Yes, so that has been communicated to operations, and they've been told, their staff have been notified to not dispose of any of that excess material on the slope.
To not dispose of it, okay.
Yep.
There was the natural undergrowth. There was also stuff that people had dumped there, I believe.
Okay, yeah, so the stuff that people have dumped there, I don't think we know entirely where that's come from. And that was, I think operations had actually said themselves that generally what they're doing is they're cutting the lawns and they use mulchers. So there's generally not a lot of waste that come from them. So they've made sure that their staff don't dispose of any there. In terms of stuff that's coming from another source, I don't know exactly what we can do in that case other than sort of keep an eye on it. And I can follow up with operations to have them notify me if they do see that is continuing to occur. And then maybe we sort of put some more resources towards monitoring that on a regular basis so we can try to determine where that yard waste is coming from.
There was two aspects to the undergrowth. There was one on the slope, which is fine, which stabilizes the slope, but some of that was creeping onto the cemetery itself and covering over monuments.
Yeah, so there's at least one monument that does get entirely covered during the summer months when the foliage comes out on the vines and that sort of thing. And I think that operations has always been of the perspective of keeping up with what had been done and wasn't necessarily proactively trying to cut anything back there for fear of it having negative implications on the slope stability. So this is something that I think probably needs to be discussed again with operations. And that's something I'll make note of, and I can follow up with them. But like I said, everything they've told me so far is that they're sort of keeping an eye on the situation and trying to limit anything that they dispose of on the slope.
Chair?
Okay, so there's no role there for an individual like myself to go along with his clippers then?
I won't answer that one publicly, but if you like to go for walks, I mean, that's on you.
I think I see Pam with her hand raised.
Yes, I'm wondering if maybe a first step would be for the town to put up some signs. No dumping of yard waste or something, right? Even a sign basically about the significance of the site and please respect it or something.
Yeah, I think that could be a good idea. A couple considerations there are, as you know, we're not the landowner, so any opportunity for us to put up signage on the site would have to go through the landowner. And I think we'd have to find a way to do that very tastefully. because we don't want to sort of riddle this site with all kinds of signage that's going to take away from the natural beauty of it. But I think the bigger point is getting that information out there, whether it's by sign or whether it's by a notice in the mailbox of all of the surrounding neighbors. Because if it is third parties, if you will, bringing their yard waste and dumping it on this site, I don't imagine they're traveling across town to do it. I imagine they're crossing the street or they're coming from a few properties away. So, maybe it's a combination of the two, having one clear sign that indicates near the bank not to be dumping, but also doing some follow-up with all of the local residents as well.
Well, I mean, there is a shoulder on the road that they'd have to cross to get through the cemetery to dump something. And I mean, and maybe not a sign that says do not dump, maybe something that is a little bit more sympathetic to the fact that it's, a historic site, etc.
Sure. Yeah. And so just as a reminder, we do have quite a substantial plaque right in the center of this cemetery as well, speaking to the historical significance of it. So, I mean, if people do enter near that sort of central monument where you have the collection of all of the monuments together embedded in that concrete and stone base, then hopefully they're aware of the historic nature. But you're right, that was something I hadn't thought of. We do obviously own the boulevard alongside any street side, so we would have the opportunity to put up signage there.
Yeah.
Okay, so
Councillor Ballard, who's next?
Thank you, Chair. So Mike, has the owner been aware that they could apply for the facade improvement this whole time?
Yes, the owner has been made aware of that. And during initial discussions, it's something that they seem to be quite encouraged by. So, we've had in our discussions in the past, we've spoken to the fact that there has historically been a small budget that's maintained by the church for the purpose of doing work on this property. So, and it is quite a small budget. So any support they could get in that sense would obviously be a good thing. I think their intentions are good, or I hope their intentions are good, and that they really do want to get this done, and they're just having capacity issues with it. But absolutely, they have been aware that there is funding available.
And do you think they would be eligible for the full amount?
They would be, yes. Okay. So we know that the way the funding works is that there's $10,000 available for just for the straight aesthetic components, which they would be eligible for, just like anyone else. But there's also an extra $5,000 that they'd be eligible for. That's really for issues relating to stability. And I mean, you can make a clear case. The way it's written is generally about weatherproofing buildings and structural components like foundations. But when you look at monuments, I mean, there is no building on this site. So when you look at stabilization and structural issues, those can only be really applied to the existing monuments. And I think you could very easily make a clear case for that extra $5,000. Whether it would even be necessary is a whole nother sort of question, because the way that the program works is we can only provide up to 50% funding. So if the project did come in at $15,000 overall, then they would only be eligible for $7,500 from the town anyways, and we wouldn't even have to get into that consideration.
Thank you.
Yeah, and Steve, I will have Stephen and then Neil. Okay, go ahead.
Michael,
yes.
On the south side of the property, there was a lot of brush and things that are kind of making a fence. It would be, I think it might be better if we could have a proper fence in there on both ends of the cemetery, the south and the north.
Yeah, I don't disagree with you there. And again, that becomes an issue of the fact that this isn't our property, right? So that is something that I could raise with the property owners. And perhaps if the stabilization work came in fairly low in terms of its monetary value, maybe that's something they'd be interested in. So I think that's something we can bring up. At this point, I wouldn't push that entirely to the front of the discussion, because considering all the issues we've had just dealing with the stabilization of the monuments, I think we need to get to the finish line on that one before we can start looking at those other issues. But absolutely, I think that that's something that could enhance the sort of natural beauty of this site, and also I imagine would be appreciated by the adjacent property owner. So because it's not the sort of state of that brush can't be the greatest to look at from their property either.
Well, true.
Yeah.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Michael, just one final question. To the north of the main monument, there's a number of grave markers or memorial slabs set into the turf, horizontal. And last time I was there, they were in danger of disappearing just by the grass growing over them. Is there a record of those and the location?
I don't know if there's been anything sort of formally done in terms of keeping like a strict inventory of the numbers and also any markings on those. But that issue with the grass overtaking them has been an issue every year, and every year we've been in communication with operations to sort of help ward that off over time. And I think it's just one of those ongoing things that we'll always be dealing with. As grass starts to encroach on those, we need to cut it back. But your point is well made. It's one of those items I can touch base with operations about and make sure that they're doing their best to keep those uncovered.
Sounds like a job for a guy with a battery-driven strimmer.
You've got all kinds of suggestions for us today.
A pair of shears.
Excuse me, can you hear me?
Brenda? Yes,
Yes.
you can.
Okay, I just wanted to make one comment. We do have a list of the individuals that are interred in that cemetery. We do not have the actual locations, but the church, the owner, should have a complete list of everyone that is interred there and the location of the site. So for some of those headstones that have been moved, we may be able to get an idea of where they came from and put them back where they belong.
Thank you for that, Brenda. Mike?
All right.
Oh, I had just one more question.
Really, go ahead.
Yeah, just on a couple of things. Also, what Brenda was just mentioning, I thought the Durham Genealogical Society, or whatever you want to call them, also had a list of what was the people that were in that cemetery. But going back on what Pam and Stephen were saying, because we own that bit of the boulevard, could we not just have the whole cemetery fenced in, like the Friends Cemetery over on Mill Street, with a fence? That might stop the people from going and dumping, but it might not help with the cleaning of the property and so on, but it might help with stopping people from going into dumping.
Yeah, I think we'd have to consider that one very carefully, because I think you're right. But in terms of its other impacts, I mean, this is quite nice in the sense of it's a designated heritage property that people know they're free to enjoy. And kind of, when they're on walks with their dogs or out just for a stroll at night, they know they can walk through it and enjoy the property. And a fence might deter them in some ways. So that could deter the negative behavior, but it also may deter some of the positive behavior that we want to see. In addition to that, obviously, there's the expense and the upkeep of the fence. And from a more technical perspective, I don't know, too much about this, but in their operations department, there are all kinds of sort of technical standards for how close you can have fences and that sort of thing to a street line. Because, when you think about snow removal and cars opening their doors and that sort of thing when they're parked along the side, there's lots of considerations to be made. So it's not something that I think we would move forward with right away, or something that we would outright say, no, it's not going to work. It is something that we can consider, and that may be part of a sort of general solution for this property.
Okay.
All right. I'm going to try to fire through these next couple ones because we've had more questions than I was actually expecting. And I think I did jinx myself by bringing up my timing before. So the Remner Bridge plaque text is the kind of project that typically we would be very involved with as a committee. Unfortunately, because of the pandemic, it's something that I've had to take on without getting the input of the committee. But just for people that aren't familiar, the Remner Bridge is actually the bridge on Church Street North, just north of Roslyn, that runs over Duffins Creek. So there's an image of it here. This is a non-designated property. This isn't a property that we've ever had on our heritage inventory. It's a bridge that was built in 1959. However, this bridge is being replaced. So they're finishing up the project right now where a new bridge has been constructed. And as part of a major sort of infrastructure work like this, there's always an environmental assessment that goes along with it. And part of that environmental assessment does a screening for if a property has potential for heritage value. And the number that tends to be used is 40 years. If a property is older than 40 years, then it has to be investigated for heritage value. So there was a cultural heritage evaluation report that was done prior to demolition that actually determined this bridge does have cultural heritage value. And in reading over the report, the consultants that worked on it, I think their categories are a little more open than ours have been in the past when we've been evaluating these properties, because they found cultural heritage value in many, many different categories for this 1959 bridge. And so when you get to the end of the document, I mean, it was because of safety implications and you know, this is a massive infrastructure project, there was recognition that the bridge had to be removed. So what can be done in order to help preserve any of its heritage character? And the response that was given, or the recommendation that was made, was that a commemorative plaque be provided on the new replacement bridge. So I've been working with the operations team leading the project, and this is what we came up with. So it's a bronze plaque that would be inset on the side of the new concrete bridge. So it would have a raised border. It would have the town's sort of official coat of arms crest, and then the name of the bridge, Remner Bridge, with the following text. There has been a bridge spanning Duffins Creek at this location since at least the mid-1800s. Early bridges would have been constructed of timber and would have served to connect the northern areas of the township with the developing village of Duffins Creek, now Pickering Village, to the south. A permanent single-span steel beam girder bridge was installed in 1959, but was replaced in 2020 with the existing triple-span precast concrete girder bridge. So it's a very, very sort of quick representation of the history here, with the main points being, this has historically been an important crossing, and there's been a number of different bridges over time, none of which has, you know, lasted necessarily all that long. They've all been part of the same story. And what's happened now is just the continuation of that, replacing the former bridge with something new. So the initial text that was shared, that was written by the consultant working on this project, was very, very focused on the mechanical and the technical aspects of that 1959 bridge. So I think the thought was that we should really be conserving the history of that 1959 bridge. I think the greater importance here is the sort of continuity of new bridges constantly being built over this crossing, and this always being an important crossing point. And this is one of those things where the main consultant on this project was an engineer. So naturally, they're going to gear the text towards the more mechanical aspects, the really technical part of how the bridge was built. But in my mind, and in speaking with colleagues, we really thought that, you know, this was more about that story overall than the technical aspects of the last bridge, because the new bridge is going to have its technical components as well. And with a small little plaque like this, there's really not that much real estate to give a full story. And if people are interested, they can see that, you know, this plaque was erected by the town of Ajax. If they're looking for more information, we can always make the Heritage Consultants report available. So any comments on this one?
Sorry, this is going on the side of the bridge is what you're suggesting, or one of the concrete pillars or so? Is there a sidewalk there that anybody would be going to read this at all?
To tell you the truth, I did not even stop to think of that myself. I imagine there is a sidewalk there, but I will look into that and get back to you. I think regardless, because this was the recommendation of the report, it was acknowledged that this has to be part of the new bridge. So whether or not it's one that sees a lot of eyes is a sort of secondary component to this, but your question is a good one, and I will look into that.
I wouldn't want to be stopping on the bridge just to read it and have people lined up behind me.
It's a very good point.
Chair?
Yes,
I'm just wondering about the name, Remner Bridge. Is that the historical name?
So it is the name that the 1959 bridge went by. And the interesting part about this is that it's well documented in sort of regional and town documents as being the Remner Bridge.
Oh.
But there was a Remmer, R-E-M-M-E-R, family in the area that was a major landholder. So it was likely supposed to refer to the Remmer property, but somewhere along the lines, it got mixed up. One letter got changed and people changed it to the Remner. And this is something that we see with historical properties right across the town, right across the province, right across the world. Over time, you'll see these inaccuracies that kind of came about over time. And once they become preserved through any sort of written document, they tend to hold true for the rest of time. So this probably was a bit of a misnomer, but it lives on because of the official naming of the bridge.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. All right, so the last item, 244 Kingston Road East. This is the McKay House, also known as Charnacy, and we'll be talking about the potential to convert this into a restaurant. And I think this is an item that I brought up very informally at a past meeting, but things are looking more and more like this really will be a restaurant now. So this property is a major sort of holding of RioCan, and it's actually, from a legal perspective, the same property as the Walmart and the Canadian Tire and the movie theater that we're probably all aware of at the intersection of Salem and Kingston Road. Now, zooming in a little bit, what we're interested in, I don't know if people can see my cursor, but right in the middle of the screen under that 244 is this building, the historical building, which was actually moved to that location during the construction of the plaza. So this is an old stone home that was quite renowned in its time, featured in the Historical Atlas of 1877. Quite a beautiful home with some work that's been done over time, but relatively speaking, been kept in fairly good shape, designated under Part 4 of the Heritage Act, and up until very recently had been home of a financial institution. So the new use that's being proposed is a fine dining restaurant. And what that means is that the restaurant use comes along with some requirements for upgrades to the mechanical systems of the building. And these mechanical systems will actually have an impact on the heritage fabric of the building. So it is something that once all is said and done, the owner will require a heritage permit. These are very sort of crude PowerPoint diagrams, but the reason I've provided them in this way is because we're at the very early stages with the potential leasee of the property, and they wanted to ensure that they would be able to make these modifications prior to committing to this site. So really what the intention of this item is today is to get some initial feedback, find out any concerns so that those can be addressed prior to any formal heritage permit application. So if the tenant does move forward, this will come back to the committee in a more formal setting for approval. So the squares down at, or rectangles down at the bottom just represent air conditioning units. There's currently one in this location, but they will need 4 of them for the new use. This whole area on the north side of the building will be fenced off for a patio. So these won't even be visible from the street. There'll be very little visual impact. The more concerning item would be the roof vent. And I'm still waiting for a little more details in terms of the exact location and the exact size. It's going to be quite a large vent because of the nature of the use. But I've already convinced the owner to move it from the front slope of the building onto the back slope. So that was, at least one concession that they've been able to make so far. And I'll keep working with them to see, how much they can reduce the size of this while still meeting any building code requirements. The more significant implications, I think, are those to the front of the building and the west side, which faces Salem. So there'll be another kind of, I don't think it's an air conditioner, but it's a similar type unit that's proposed to be at the front of this building right beside the main porch. This area is already fairly well landscaped, so I think it will be hidden quite well. However, ideally, I never like to see these kinds of interventions on the front of a building. But the unfortunate circumstance with this house is, or this building is, there's very few spaces to do it elsewhere. There's no back to this building. Every side of it is exposed to the public. So you have the road-facing side, you then have the front, then you have the east-facing side, which is entirely covered by the ramp leading to the front door, so there's no options there. And then the back we just saw, and there's already a number of interventions happening there. So really, this was the only opportunity remaining. There's also a couple of basement windows on that west side of the building, through which this sort of J-shaped vent would be located as well. So I've got another image here showing it from the just again, a sort of very rough mock-up. But the idea was, by positioning it on this side of the building, initially I wasn't very happy with that because I consider this in some ways to be the front because it's the street-facing side, but it's also the only side where you could really get away with having this unit come out through a window and not have to actually make a new opening through the building wall. So the owner, the potential lease person with the lease has said, if we are in fact able to do this, we will ensure that it is well covered with plantings so that you can't see it from the street. But from a sort of building intervention perspective, it's the best opportunity. Now, the bigger consideration, I would say, is from a technical standpoint. And we don't talk all that much about zoning at the Heritage Committee, but in this case, we have to, because this property is zoned uptown commercial, and the uptown commercial zone requires a 3-meter setback from the front lot line for any structures. So because this is going to be attached to the building, we're considering it to be part of the main building and not a structure onto itself. And the main building needs to be set back at least 3 meters. Right now, the setback is 3.47 meters, so it meets that requirement. But as soon as this vent is installed, it projects about 2 feet out from the building, which is about 60 centimeters, which means the setback will fall to 2.86 meters. Very close to the required 3 meters, but not the 3 meters. So the result of that would be them having to go forward for a minor variance, which is a fairly straightforward application. And because the encroachment in this case, 14 centimeters, is so small, I don't think there would be any issues at the Committee of Adjustment. However, being a heritage building, I think the committee would want to know our perspective on this as well. So it's important that we use this opportunity to raise any concerns that we could have with this variance application. So just to provide sort of a recap of everything here, there are some implications. These are things that I think do have negative impacts as a whole on the building. However, as we do in all these scenarios, we have to look at weighing out the implications of these impacts with the benefits of actually having a use for this building. I don't know exactly how long this building has been sitting vacant. I don't think it's been that long, but even in that short time when we haven't had people on this site constantly, when I was out taking these photos, I happened to hear quite a few birds and went over to the east side of the building and saw blackbirds actually flying up into the attic through a small crevice between the stone wall and the soffits. So something like that, those kinds of problems when you have someone on site all the time are the ones that tend to be rectified very quickly. If no one's there noticing this, these properties sort of fall into a state of disrepair. I think the use of a restaurant could be a very good one for this property, especially a fine dining restaurant where people, the owners could actually use the unique architecture to benefit the business itself. So with that information, I just wanted to kind of get that out there and find out if there were any concerns from the committee.
I got a question, Chair.
Yes, go ahead, ma'am.
Where will the kitchen be located in
So the
that
kitchen,
building?
the kitchen will actually be the entirety of the basement.
It's the
So
basement.
it'll be entirely the basement. The main floor and the upper floor will all be seating, and the seating capacity of the restaurant will nearly be doubled with the outdoor patio that will be seasonal in the back. So it's quite an interesting layout. Once I get the sort of final plans, I'd be happy to share those with the committee as well, so you can see exactly what was being proposed.
Okay. So this building stood vacant for a very long time before it did have a creative reuse. So pretty much the whole roof, it was gutted right back to the stone walls, etc., because it had been left to rot for quite a while. So, and there are certain things that I know that are not exactly the way original to the building. The scale of the windows and some of those windows were not what the original was. However, this house has had a long troubled history, and any reuse that is going to bring attention to it and have people enjoy it in the community, I think is a positive.
I would agree with that.
And then the other thing I want to just mention too, so on the back of the building, you can see the outline of the summer kitchen that used to be there. The upper, so if you go right to the very back, right, that window was actually a door at one time. Originally, when that summer kitchen was there. And I'm just wondering if there's any plan of, kind of utilizing that roof line for some type of covered, dining area or something. It was a really handsome summer kitchen at one time, and it was being used as a garage near the end of life where it sat originally.
So there haven't been any discussions of that. I think this was entirely open air with no proposed covering at this point. But if that does come up, I think that could be an interesting sort of reference to that summer kitchen, having them perhaps follow that ghost line on the outside of the building in some way.
Well, if I'm remembering correctly, I think that the wall where the summer kitchen was, I think there's more rubble stone used there than, the back of the building always is, not as finely crafted, but I think if I remember correctly, that area was even more rubble stone because there was a building up against it.
Yeah.
Are there any other comments or questions for Mike? No? Thank you very much, Mike, for all the hard work you put into making these presentations to us.
Thank you.
You're most welcome. If we could move on quickly to the next item. 4.8. Mike, you're involved in this again, but I'd have Brenda to come on and assist you with informing us on the cancellation of events and any contingency plans you have for discussion.
Thank you. Through the chair, I had mentioned at our last meeting on March 4th that there were events being planned to celebrate and recognize the 65th anniversary of the incorporation of the town. Unfortunately, due to COVID-19 and travel restrictions, none of the HMS Ajax and River Plate Veterans Associations will be visiting, and the Mayor's Gala, of course, has been canceled. All the street dedications that had been arranged to take place during that period have also been canceled. I've had no word on whether or not there is any planned rescheduling of any of these events. However, given as we're halfway through the year now, I'm not sure that there will be time to actually do that. But if I hear anything different, I will definitely let you know. And as far as the D.D. Palmer plaque unveiling, Mike, I'll leave that with you. I know we've had some discussion on this, but.
Sure. So I think, with this pandemic, one of the things that's come through the provincial government was limitations on the size of gatherings and that sort of thing. And I mean, there's no telling where we're going to be in September. And typically with a plaque unveiling, what we could say is we could just say, we'll keep pushing it off until the next time we can get together. Well, in this case, the date of the unveiling is actually written onto the bronze plaque. So we don't have that opportunity because we are looking at a specific commemoration of an event, which was the first chiropractic treatment. We are stuck with that September date. So, I think Brenda provided a recommendation that we, stick to our initial plans for the time being. And I think that's a good idea. But I also think given that our opportunities to meet prior to that September date are going to be fairly limited. So at least in the back of our heads, we have to start thinking about contingency plans. I think that the team at the town is getting some good experience kind of, problem solving in these situations and finding ways to do things digitally. And that may be the way we have to approach this, where we have a speaker or two, maybe a couple members of council, and maybe, somebody from the chiropractic profession, or I don't know who that sort of keynote speaker could be, or even if we necessarily want to have one. But if we do, it's something we should start thinking about how we could limit the number of people that actually need to be there on site, and then come up with sort of alternative roles for us in terms of broadcasting this virtually, or finding ways to all take part in this celebration while not doing it by physically being present. So I don't think we need to necessarily have that conversation right now unless anybody has any suggestions. But like I said, things just to keep in mind in case we get to the point where we have to start problem solving.
Mike, what was the date? September
21st,
something?
wasn't it?
Yeah, it was the early 20s. I don't remember exactly the date, but I could take a look.
September 20th.
20th, okay.
Madam Chair, excuse me. I have to leave the meeting now. Apologies.
Okay, you are excused, Neil. Have a good evening.
Bye now.
You may go ahead, Mr. Wood.
Facebook Live is a great resource for getting live events out with a minimum of trouble. So that's perhaps something we could think of is putting it out on Facebook Live. That's my suggestion.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other comments on that? No, thank you. We'll move on now to items 4.9 and 4.10. And I'll ask Brenda to take us through those.
Okay, as you know, we offer a bursary for the Patrick Shane Award for History to a graduating student of each of the 5 Ajax high schools. At this point, I have issued 2 of the bursaries to the high schools, and I've had confirmation from 3 of the schools that the commencement ceremonies are being scheduled for October or sometime in the fall. So any of the graduating ceremonies that were scheduled for June, of course, have been postponed and rescheduled. So once I have confirmation of those scheduled dates, I will let you know, and we can discuss who may be able to attend to make the presentation on behalf of the committee at that time.
Okay. You may continue, Brendan.
Okay, so again, I had reported at our last meeting that we'd had some discussion with the Brain Injury Association of Durham with a special exhibit. And I just wanted to let you know that the exhibit has been completed. It is in place. It's in the foyer off of the Heritage Square entrance at Town Hall. We have 40 masks that have been loaned to us by the association. All of these masks were created by members of the association who have suffered brain injury. So when the town hall is once again open, I encourage you to come in and take a look at this exhibit. We are still hoping to have a formal unveiling of this exhibit. And with that, some of the individuals whose masks are on display would be in attendance. But again, given the circumstances, we had initially hoped to do this in June, since it is Brain Injury Month, but we're probably looking now into the fall for this. So if you know, once Town Hall opens and you get an opportunity, come in and take a look at the exhibit. It's actually pretty impressive.
Great. Go ahead, Councilor Bauer.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to make a comment on that, Brenda. Thank you. I was wondering if that display was going to go forward, so I'm really glad to hear that it is. That's it. Just a comment. Thank you.
Okay.
Any other comments or any questions? No. Thank you. We'll move on to correspondence. Is there any correspondence? No. We'll move on to item number 6, update from Council. Councilor Bauer, did you have anything you'd like to share with us today?
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to let everyone know the same that this Heritage Committee had to sort of be put on the back burner in March when the pandemic started. That also happened to Council. All of our events were either canceled or put on hold, including Council meetings. But we did resume them, the official Council meetings, in April. So we had one in April, one in May, and we just restarted one of our committee meetings, the General Governance Committee meeting, which will start next week. So we're looking forward to that. And Jeff had mentioned Facebook Live as a great way to sort of interact with residents. So each ward in mid-May held a ward meeting that we normally would have had, at a location in person, but we did them on Facebook Live instead. And it was actually a lot of fun, very interactive, pretty well attended, and it was nice to have that connection, because it's very easy to feel disconnected when everything is on the computer nowadays. So that went very well, and the mayors had a couple meetings as well in the same method, which were well received. So that's it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Councilor Bauer, for your comments. Item number 7, any other business from anyone on the committee? Pam, you may go ahead. She's
You're muted.
Yeah, she's muted.
Thank you. Sorry about that. I have 2 items. One is the minutes from the last meeting about this, the promotional of the swag. I sent some information to you, Mike, and to Sarah. Did you get it? Are they gone?
No, this was
Sarah can't be gone. She's here.
this was months ago.
Yeah.
Was it not? Okay, yes, I did receive that. Yes.
Okay, and I'd said about in my email I said about requesting samples because they would provide samples if you requested. Do you remember that?
Yes, I do.
I just pulled up the emails here and it was regarding the screen cleaners and you were going to look into acquiring some samples for us.
No, I was asking if you would acquire the samples.
Oh, if we had done so, no.
Yeah, if you would do that.
That has been undertaken at this time, not on my part.
Okay. Okay, so could you could we request samples though, so that because you're a business, I'm not, right?
Yep,
So
that's not a problem. I will put that on my to-do list for tomorrow.
okay, and there was some pricing there as well. And the other item is regarding the promotional video, which obviously during this challenging time hasn't been completed, and I haven't heard anything more. So I just want to confirm that I will send an email. And I mean, we don't know what September is going to look like, or October for that matter, but I will send an email just to follow up. Okay.
Great, thank you, Pam. Anyone else has any? Councillor Bauer?
Thank you, Chair. That reminded me, Pam, that I was also looking into some swag information from the communications office, the little pop socket things that go on the back of your cell phones.
Right.
So I will get that information to Sarah as soon as I have it. Thank you.
Okay, can I just add? So the vendors that I had sent to Sarah and Mike also provide those as well. So
oh, good. Okay.
it's another source.
Yeah.
I didn't send that information to them, but I did notice when I was going through, they do provide that.
Good stuff.
Through the chair, I have another question for the committee. Okay, for actually Pam and Anderson, last meeting, we had touched on an update as far as the history of the St. Francis Church is concerned. The big anniversary is next year, and I know that recreation staff are going to want to start looking at getting that grant proposal in. So I was just wondering if there was any update on the status of that that report.
Yeah, I'd done some more work on it, and then it kind of fell off my radar to send it on. So this is a good reminder for me to send it on. So I will send it on, and I still do have the book that you had provided us with the history and the timeline.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Any other comments? No, thank you so very much, everyone, for making this meeting a success. This now concludes our meeting, and may I have a motion to adjourn the meeting? Councillor Bauer, and seconded by Jay Wood. Sorry, Stephen, he beat you to it. Have a good evening, everyone, and see you at our next meeting.
Thank you.
Good night.
Bye.
Bye.